Hello. This is chapter 5. We're talking about attitudes. Where you get them? What are they? How do they affect you? I didn't find out till I was a senior in undergraduate that attitudes aren't that great of predictors of behavior. And I was in the middle of like doing this research study in psychology based on that. And then my supervisor, professor said, "Oh yeah, they're not that strongly associated." Well, what's the point of assessing attitudes if they're that not great of a predictor of behavior? He's like, "Well, it's social psychology," and here we are. So we have attitudes. I got Trump and Obama up there. Some of you may favor one, some of the other. What do they do for us? Our attitudes will hopefully, to some degree, especially in at least the upcoming presidential election, determine some of our behavior, whether we vote or not, who we vote for. Our attitudes are evaluations. Everything about our attitudes involves some level of ABC, affect, behavior, and cognition. And the ones with a lot of emotion, those are probably going to affect our behaviors more. The cognitions, that varies on how much influence it has on behavior. When do attitudes guide our behavior? One, when they're really strong. Two, when we've stated our intention to do something. So if you're going to like start an exercise program, you should tell all your friends, you should tell your family, you should tell everyone, because then people are going to follow up. It's like, hey, have you done that? Are you doing that? And we're going to feel more like, oh yeah, I really committed to this. I want to do this. So that's something. If we state our intention, that attitude is going to more likely influence our behaviors. When our attitude and behavior are both called up in the same situation, so that's definitely including being in the voting box. If we get really specific about our behaviors, and actually there's research studies to support this too. Not generally do you I'm trying to think of like one baseball team or one basketball team better than another, but like if it's about like actually attending, like having to pay and go to a game by that team, the more specific you get about that, that's more connected to the strength of your attitude and your behavior. Low self-monitors have their attitudes guide their behavior a lot more. High self-monitors are always looking at the situation, figure out how should I act here. But low self-monitors don't even pay attention to that as much. Where do our attitudes come from? And once again, I'm going to learning theory. I know in one of the chapters so far, I did the learning theory in a nutshell, but just remember, association learning, also called classical conditioning, where we associate two things, operant conditioning, and observational learning, where we watch others and then imitate their behaviors. That's going to be related to our attitudes. So we learn them at home, using those three forms of learning. We learn them in school. We learn them with our friends. We learn them in our communities. This is where we pick up our attitudes, obviously. If someone's going to try to persuade us to change our attitudes, there's several things. Actually, I want to go back to that classical conditioning thing. Persuading our attitudes about products, I know, is a big component of any sort of advertising you see on the internet or on a TV show. And they're going to try to have attractive people along with their products, so you make that association. Sports stars, they're going to have that associated with the product, so you associate those things. Humor, they get you to laugh and you have a good positive feeling, you're going to be more likely to think positively when you see that product. So classical conditioning comes in heavily. We're going to look at messenger and also the strength of the message as factors that influence persuasion of our attitudes. I always think of some factors about the messenger. I use the acronym EAT. Are they expert? Are they attractive? Are they trustworthy? Now, if someone's going to persuade us to something, those things, actually, expert may be a little bit more than the other things. I know I'm trustworthy too. But attractiveness, should that affect whether we're persuaded by someone? It does. Actually, these three factors are things that influence whether we're persuaded by someone, whether it be a political message or to buy something from a commercial. There's a big model, and I have a couple slides on this one, about how people try to persuade you to change your attitudes. The best route or the best way to do it is to use logic and strong arguments, as long as people will and can think about the issue that you're talking about. A lot of people are distracted. A lot of people don't believe that their efforts are worth the time. A lot of people think they can't make a difference. And those folks are not going to use strong and logical arguments. Typically, they'll process information. And so the central route of processing, also called the thoughtful message processing, is like you listen closely to arguments that are being presented, and then you weigh that out. It's like, is that logical? Is it backed up by science? Does that make sense? If you change your attitudes that way, they're going to be strong and they're going to predict your behavior. But if we're not that invested, we're more likely to use like peripheral vision, the peripheral cues. So that is going to be how expert, attractive, and trustworthy the messenger is. Also, I mean, if you're trying to persuade someone using peripheral cues, if you distract your audience through humor or attractiveness, music, you're going to be more likely to get a person going along because they're going to have a positive emotional reaction to your message just because you've made them laugh or you brought up a song. If you make your arguments long, they may not even be listening to them, but they're like, he's talking a lot. He must have something to say. If you use a lot of references or talk fast, I don't mean to talk fast, but I do. Typically, that's a peripheral cue that people will be more persuaded by you. If you speak with no hesitations, I use a lot of ums. I'm trying to do that less. You will be more persuasive if you don't use those hesitations. This is a model for how we have the central route processing, which is the more effortful, versus the peripheral route, which is automatic and effortless and doesn't require any thought. So pay attention to this, study that, something I'll be asking you to be familiar with. I mentioned this already, people who change their attitudes based on analysis are thoughtful, effortful, central route processing, keep it longer, behave in a way that's consistent with that attitude, and are more resistant to counter arguments. So we have the source of a persuader. Is the source credible? One of the things that, and are they trustworthy? So credibility has to do with both how expert someone is and trustworthy. If you see someone advertising cough medicine on TV and it appears to be a waiter or waitress, that's probably going to make less difference than if it's a physician that says, we've tested this, and once you have an expert like a physician, if they go, oh, I got a cough, so I should probably listen to this person. Also, how trustworthy. A lot of politicians use this. They will try to present themselves. We just talked about self-presentation in the last chapter as trustworthy, someone who comes from the community that they're appealing to make themselves more trustworthy. Actually, some of the things that happen on Amazon is that, you know, the reviews for a product at the bottom, they will pay people to write those reviews, but ask them to put typos in it so they appear more like they're coming from real people, so they appear more trustworthy. Likability, I just also mentioned this in terms of politicians. If the person who's running for office makes themselves appear more similar to the community they're appealing to, they're more likely to be voted for. Attractiveness is an obvious thing. The sleeper effect is another thing about the source that's kind of strange. So you know how you can hear something and then weeks later you're like, I can't remember who said it, but this is something I heard. And what's strange is sometimes the source is important, especially if they're expert and they are truly trustworthy. But if weeks later we can't remember who told us what, it doesn't matter. One famous study, this is a chart of the results of a study on persuasion. If you look at people who are trying to be persuaded by using either a high credibility source or low credibility source, if it was a high credibility source delivering a message, you see more percent of people listening to that and having their attitudes change. Where if it's somebody who appears to know nothing about it, that's going to result in little attitude change. But you give it some time, 4 weeks later, and you assess those same attitudes. What happens is the effectiveness of the high credibility source goes down, while the effectiveness of the low credibility source, it's kind of like it's all meshes together. And then you said, they said, because you can't remember who said it. I know it looks like these two things at the end are different. They're not. So it goes from making an immediate significant difference to having no significant difference in the two presenters at all. It's called the sleeper effect. You sleep on it for 4 weeks, you'll forget who said it. One way to try to persuade people to do something is using fear. There are actual cigarette warnings like this on the side of cigarette packets. Fear can motivate people, but the best way to do that is then to provide a solution to the thing you're trying to cause them to be fearful about. Back a few years ago, they used to have antiperspirant commercials where they're trying to stimulate fear in the viewers. It's like you raise your arm and then everybody around you passes out because you stink so bad. Their idea was, then if you use this product, you won't have that happen. So again, you get people who are writing commercials trying to use fear, but as long as they provide the solution, they're more likely to persuade you. Same with acne commercials. They'll try to make it look like you don't want this bad thing to happen to you, and so use our product and you'll avoid it. That's basically the same as using negative reinforcement as part of operant conditioning. One more study on the elaboration likelihood model. I'm just going to talk about this briefly and show you the results. Researchers basically went to study college students. Some college students were, and they were saying like, okay, we're trying to determine whether we're going to institute comprehensive exams in order for students to graduate. Some were told in terms of personal relevance, this will affect you. So you're like juniors. So if we pass this resolution to have comprehensive exams, you're going to have to take it in order to graduate. Others were told this won't be instituted until after you graduate. Then they had people get up and deliver the arguments about why you should have a comprehensive exam in order to be able to graduate. Some of the arguments that some people heard were strong, others were heard were weak. They were more like personal stories and opinions. And then you had who was delivering the message. So 3 different variables: the relevance of it, how good the arguments were, and who's delivering it. Was it a high expertise source, a research institute, or was it a low expertise? Like, oh, this was a project adopted by the local high school psychology class, and here's the stuff that they found. If you look at it, basically, I put in the end result, the result supported elaboration likelihood model, that thoughtful processing required strong arguments. But if it's not, and people, if it was personally relevant, they were paying attention to that. If they were like, these comprehensive exams aren't going to affect you, people didn't pay attention. So here's the results, basically. Low personal relevance, basically, people were more influenced by the source, so that goes kind of the peripheral route. But when it comes to arguments here, I'm pointing to the screen, you can't even see my fingers. At the bottom, basically, if you see here that they have high personal relevance, that these comps are going to affect you, then when the strong arguments were there, that dramatically affected people's attitudes versus if there were weak arguments, they did not. So another study in support of the elaboration likelihood model. Some other things about messages is that they can be affected. You might want to think about this in terms of parenting. If you let your kids know that other people are going to try to persuade them to do certain things, that's called forewarning. They're like, oh, okay. I mean, that just kind of gives a person a heads up. I mean, even if you go into, I mean, there have been some presentations made at Lincoln since I've been a faculty member that in the Fall Faculty Institute. It's like, I realized as I'm sitting there that, oh, these folks have been brought on board to try to get us to adopt an online learning system. And it's like, okay, and knowing that beforehand makes you a lot more like resistant and uncomfortable. It's like, you're trying to persuade me. Another way to try to diminish the effectiveness of someone's persuasion attempts is to inoculate them. And that is to give a person a small dose of something so that, if you think about, again, having kids, and if you like tell your kids, like, you know, people are going to try to get you to smoke weed, and they're going to say, hey, it's medical's legal now, and it doesn't last long, it doesn't affect you. And if you tell your kids, like, this is what they're going to say, that's just going to give them more of a heads up so they can develop their own kind of responses to what they're likely to hear as they get older. And that can be an effective strategy. If you start to feed someone, like, here are things you're likely to hear when someone tries to persuade you to do something. That gives them a chance to like chew on it, think about it, and develop their own response, and then act in accordance with their own values and attitudes. Sorry, I put Cartman up here, it makes me laugh. You tell somebody you can't do something, what do you want to do? You want to do it. That's called reactance. Basic. So it's principle of adolescence. Basically, I put up here, if you're told you can't do something, you want that forbidden option more, you'll try to reassert your freedom to get the option back, and you'll feel angry and aggressive towards the people who limited your freedom. Reactance. All these three components are important. And they show basically, you can even manipulate people this way. I mean, when you have video games and movies rated mature, younger kids want those options more because they've been restricted. It feels like their freedom's been restricted. So another area, I know we are at 15 minutes, but I probably have at least another 5 minutes to go, is the connection between behavior and attitudes when we're talking about cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when we have two attitudes that clash with one another, or our behaviors and attitudes clash. We can do several things about that. We can change one of our thought processes. We could add new cognitions. We can minimize something so we think it's not important, or we can justify our behavior or our dominant cognition. So right now, I think the most classic one is cognitive dissonance people have about wearing masks during the coronavirus. So if someone has read the research and knows it's effective, and then they're not wearing a mask, what are they going to say to themselves? That's if someone points it out, like, hey, why aren't you wearing a mask? Their behavior is they're not wearing a mask. They're probably going to diminish the research on that, saying, well, that's whatever way they might justify it. It's like that's only true for old people or immunocompromised people. I'm healthy. I don't have any problem with that. So they'll try to ease their dissonance, which is basically discomfort, a clash in their mind, by trying to diminish one set of arguments so that they can feel better about themselves. A classic study, I was going to describe this in detail, but instead I'm going to ask you to read about it. It's Festinger and Carl Smith are the authors of this. Please read about it in your book and know the details. I will ask you about it later. More on cognitive dissonance. When we have, basically, anytime we treat someone inhumanely, if we truly believe every human is worthy of good treatment and respect, we have to do something in our brains. And so I think that's a lot of what happens when someone dehumanizes someone. It makes a person more capable of treating someone physically horribly, killing them, beating them, treating them like they're not human. And people who are participating in that aggression and violence have to be engaging in this relief of dissonance by telling themselves, these folks deserve this treatment. I think it's the core of a lot of racist and a lot of just power problems in our society, is that dehumanization, seeing someone as less than human, helps relieve a person of cognitive dissonance, because you see someone as fully human as yourself, and you can then fully empathize with them. You would never treat another human being in that way. Another aspect about dissonance, being gay, most of you know that I'm gay. And so if you didn't, you now know, but when it comes to being a gay person, your sexual orientation identity is invisible. And so this works on dissonance, because people may come to know you and like you. You come out to them later on, they're like, especially if they don't like gay and lesbian people, LGBTQ, sorry. But if they've seen themselves treat you favorably and then let you into their kind of friendship circle, something's got to change. And it's harder to change your behavior at that point. So I think this is one of the reasons there's been such a dramatic change in attitudes towards LGBTQ people, is because of the invisible nature of that minority status. I wish the same could be true when it came to racial status, but that's a visible minority status. But it operates on cognitive dissonance. I think this shift in acceptance cognitive dissonance has played a major role. Sometimes when we commit to things, it's hard to change. So I'm only talk about one of these two studies. We have fraternities and sororities on campus. A lot of times there's hazing that still happens, and to get in those. The reason they want people to pay a high price, they'll have them do a severe initiation where they embarrass themselves, publicly humiliate themselves sometimes, is that so once they gain membership and they're asked to pay dues and stay active as members, it will be very difficult for them to say, I'm going to quit, it doesn't matter that much to me, because they're going to realize I paid a very high price to be a member of this group, to suddenly turn and say, it doesn't matter to me, would create too much dissonance. How could it not matter to me when I pay this high a price? That is the definition of dissonance. And so a person will continue to be an active member supporting the sorority fraternity over and over again. There are a couple persuasion strategies that rely on dissonance. I'm just going to mention one, and the other is, I'll also mention, I guess, briefly. One's called the foot in the door technique, and that's based on old sales techniques where a person who went door to door trying to sell stuff would literally get their foot in your door. And then once they had that, they're more likely to dump out all their stuff and show it to you. And you said, okay, I've let them in this far. I must believe something they're telling me. So you watch your own behaviors. That's part of self-perception theory. You watch our own behaviors and we change what our attitudes are. And that's a weird route to go. Basically determine your attitudes by watching your own behavior. I must like this cake because I ate the whole thing. So the foot in the door technique, one famous study, the researchers went around the neighborhood, this one area in this neighborhood, asked people to sign a petition to put up, or to support driving safely. A few weeks later, they went back and they said, hey, we're coming back around. Would you be willing to have this, like, I'm trying to think how big the sign was. It was a pretty big sign in your front yard for a couple weeks saying, please drive safely. You can guess who was more willing to put the big sign in their yard for a couple weeks. It's the ones who signed the petition a couple weeks earlier. The ones who didn't sign the petition, it's like, no, didn't like your stupid petition then, I'm not putting a sign in my yard. But the ones who'd already signed, basically those researchers had a foot in the door. And so it's like, well, you supported us once, can't you do it again? They were more likely to put the sign in the yard. There's something else called the low ball strategy, which I want you to read about in your book because this video is already going long. And I'm going to ask you to read about this. This is well described in your textbook. And it's basically that if you get someone doing something they automatically like, and then you start providing other means for reward for something they already enjoy, it tends to diminish the degree they feel rewarded by doing that just on their own. It's called overjustification. Read about it, and that should end us for chapter 5 for today. I hope this has helped.